used to think love was the one thing money couldn't buy. That was before I learned it can. If you're the one being bought. Even now, when I think back to those early years, it's hard to see the lies. Everything looked so perfect then. So alive. The air itself seemed warmer when Daniel was near. He had that kind of charm that felt effortless, the kind that made you feel like being seen by him was a privilege. I was 21, fresh out of dreams, and he looked at me like I was one of his. We met at a university gala. My father had sponsored the event, and I was there reluctantly, bored, overdressed, and wishing to disappear into the wallpaper. Then Daniel appeared. Confident, disarming. His suit wasn't expensive, but he wore it like it was. He said something funny, something trivial, but the way he said it, casual, unbothered, made me laugh in a way I hadn't in weeks. I didn't realize it then, but that laugh was the first thing he ever took from me. In the beginning, everything about him felt genuine. He listened when I spoke. He remembered the small things, how I liked my coffee, the kind of books I hid under my pillow, the songs I played when I couldn't sleep. He made me feel known in ways even my family never managed to. My father adored him. My mother said he was ambitious, which in our world meant useful. I thought she was being cynical. Now I know she was simply right. Back then, I wasn't naive. I was just untouched. I believed in people, in love, in the kind of sincerity that money couldn't distort. My father's company was a quiet empire, and though I'd grown up in its shadow, I never imagined anyone would see me as an extension of it. But Daniel did. He saw not just the girl at the gala, he saw the legacy behind her. And from that moment on, he made me believe he saw only me. Our love story moved quickly. Late-night walks, shared dreams, promises spoken in whispers. He talked about our future with conviction, a house by the sea, children who looked like me, growing old together. When he proposed, it was simple but perfect. Just the two of us in the garden behind my parents' home, the air thick with spring. I said yes before he even finished asking. I thought love should be instinctive. I thought the heart never lies. The wedding was everything a young woman could dream of. Soft music, white roses, laughter echoing across marble halls. I remember looking at him as we danced and thinking, this is it. This is the beginning of forever. But sometimes, forever has an expiration date you can't see. The years that followed looked beautiful from the outside. We built a home, a life filled with milestones. Anniversaries, business dinners, charity events, vacations that glittered on the surface. He became my father's right hand in the company. Strategic, dependable, admired. People often said we were the perfect couple, love and power entwined. And I smiled, always smiled, because I believed it too. But perfection is rarely peaceful. Looking back, there were moments, small ones, that should have told me something was wrong. The way his eyes lit up when business was mentioned, but dimmed when I spoke of art. The way he charmed board members was with the same words he once used to charm me. The way he always seemed. Alert, calculating, even in rest, but I was in love. And love has a way of silencing intuition. Years turned into decades, and our lives merged seamlessly with my father's empire. Daniel rose through the ranks, not just as my husband, but as something more, a partner, an heir in all but name. He made my father proud. He made me proud too. I thought his ambition was for us, for the family we'd built. I never realized it was always for himself. The night it all began to unravel was ordinary. A dinner, laughter, candlelight. 25 years married. I remember the way he reached for my hand across the table, the practiced warmth in his smile, the way his voice softened as he said, "To us." I lifted my glass and met his eyes, and for the first time, something in them felt empty. It wasn't absence. It was precision. Like a man rehearsing a role he'd played too long. The kind of gaze that looks at you but doesn't see you anymore. I didn't know then what was coming, but somewhere deep inside something shifted. A whisper in my mind. Quiet but persistent. What if the love you built your life around was never real at all? I pushed the thought away. After all, we were happy, weren't we? 25 years. A lifetime of shared history, laughter, family, and partnership. What could still be a lie? I told myself it was just fatigue, just my imagination. Because love, when it's old, sometimes forgets how to sparkle. But peace has a way of hiding storms beneath it. And mine was about to break open. It started with the little things. It always does. After 25 years, you stop expecting surprises. Love becomes a quiet rhythm, familiar, reliable, almost invisible. You stop looking for passion and you start counting on peace. So, when that peace begins to hum with something offbeat, it takes time before you even notice the sound. For me, it began with the office. Daniel's second home. He'd always been dedicated, tireless even. My father admired that about him, often saying Daniel was the son he never had. He'd say it right in front of me, laughing, proud. And Daniel would smile modestly, pretending it embarrassed him, though I saw the pride in his eyes. He liked being seen that way. Indispensable, trustworthy. After my father passed, Daniel inherited the position that had been waiting for him all along. Chief Executive Officer of the company my grandfather built from nothing. A title I'd always assumed he'd earned. But one evening, as I waited for him to come home, I realized I didn't know what he actually did there anymore. I used to visit his office, bring him lunch, and sit in the corner while he worked. But somewhere along the years, those visits stopped. He'd said he was too busy, that the board didn't like distractions. I accepted that. But now, sitting alone at our long dining table, I began to wonder, when did too busy become don't come? He came home late that night. Expensive cologne? A calm smile. No explanation. I asked how work was. He said fine. I asked about dinner. He said he'd already eaten. It was small, ordinary even. But something in the tone didn't feel like marriage anymore. It felt like management. Over the following weeks, I noticed patterns I'd never questioned before. The way he avoided looking at me during breakfast, how he answered questions with careful brevity, like every word was part of a script. When he touched me, it was out of habit, brief, polite. The affection was gone, but the choreography remained. I began waking earlier, just to watch him before he left. I'd see him knot his tie, check his reflection, and adjust his cufflinks, always immaculate, always in control. But there was an edge of performance now, the kind that people wear when they're lying to themselves. It wasn't another woman I suspected. Not yet. It was something else, something colder, like his love had expired, and he hadn't bothered to tell me. I tried to bring it up one night. We were in bed, the room heavy with the soft hum of the city outside. I said, "Do you ever think we've changed too much?" He didn't look up from his phone. "Change is inevitable." "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" His voice was calm, unreadable. "I mean us," I said. "Sometimes it feels like He cut me off. "We're fine, Anna. Don't overthink things." And that was the end of it. A conversation flattened before it even began, but silence doesn't erase doubt. It amplifies it. I began to feel like a ghost in my own house, present, yet unseen. Our life together continued with clockwork precision. Dinners, events, shared schedules. Everything looked normal, but beneath it all, a quiet ache grew, slow and deliberate. Then came the gala. It was one of those charity events Daniel loved, the kind where everyone wears masks of generosity while measuring each other's worth in handshakes. I had gone out of habit, dressed in something simple, classic. The moment we arrived, I felt the distance between us stretch wider. He drifted through the crowd like a politician, all smiles and confidence. I followed silently, the practiced wife, the perfect accessory. Halfway through the evening, I stepped away to find some air. That's when I overheard them. 2 men from the board standing near the balcony, glasses in hand. I didn't mean to listen, but the mention of Daniel's name froze me in place. "Smart move, marrying into the family," one said, laughing softly. The other replied, "Well, he's always known how to secure his future. Timing, connections. He played it perfectly." Their voices blurred into a haze of noise, but those words landed like a cold slap. Marrying into the family. Securing his future. I turned, pretending not to have heard. My pulse quickened. My vision sharpened in that strange way it does when pain is too sudden to fully feel. I forced myself to walk away slowly, gracefully, as if my world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. When Daniel found me later, he placed his hand at the small of my back and asked if I was all right. I smiled. "Of course," I said, but my voice sounded like someone else's. That night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation replayed in my head, again and again. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was gossip. But the seed had been planted, and once a seed of doubt takes root, it grows, even in silence. I began noticing more. Small details that had once seemed harmless. The way Daniel's name appeared on documents tied to the company's expansion. The ease with which he spoke about legacy and position. The way my father had trusted him, blindly, almost lovingly. I remembered a comment my father once made years ago. Daniel reminds me of myself when I was young, driven, strategic. I used to think that was a compliment. Now it sounded like foreshadowing. In the mornings, I'd watch Daniel leave for work and realize how little of him I truly knew. 25 years, and he was still a stranger in the parts of his life that mattered most. Then, one afternoon, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a letter tucked inside an old folder in my father's study, a draft of an agreement I'd never seen before. My father's handwriting dated the year before our wedding. The letter detailed the terms of an informal understanding between him and Daniel, discussions about future shares, executive placements, and long-term succession plans. My name appeared once, briefly, in a single line. Upon marriage, Daniel will assume mentorship under the family trust. The words burned. Upon marriage. It wasn't a love story. It was a transaction. I read the letter twice. Then again, slower. The paper trembled in my hands. Everything around me blurred. The shelves, the clock, the faint tick-tick-tick that suddenly felt deafening. My entire marriage. The laughter, the memories, the decades of devotion, tilted on its axis. He hadn't just loved me alongside my father's company. He had loved me because of it. The letter slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. I stared at it for a long time, until the ink seemed to blur and the words became ghosts. Part of me wanted to storm into his office, throw the letter at him and demand the truth. But another part, the quieter, wiser part, told me to wait. Because sometimes, when you rush to uncover a lie, you miss how deep it really runs. So I said nothing. I put the letter back carefully, as if hiding evidence from myself. That night, when Daniel came home, I watched him pour a drink, loosen his tie, smile that familiar smile, and for the first time in 25 years, I didn't see my husband. I saw a man playing a role he'd rehearsed for decades. He turned to me, glass in hand. "You're quiet tonight." I met his eyes and forced a small smile. "Just thinking," I said. "About what?" "About how time changes people." He chuckled softly, sipping his drink. "It doesn't change us." I watched the amber liquid swirl in his glass, reflecting light like molten gold, the color of illusion. No, I thought. It doesn't change you at all. He still didn't know I'd seen the letter. He still thought I was blind, and for now, that was exactly how I wanted it to be. The weeks that followed were a study in silence. Deliberate, heavy, strategic silence. I moved through the house like a ghost with a secret. My footsteps soft against the marble floors that had once echoed laughter. Every room still carried pieces of our history. Framed vacations, anniversary photos, notes I'd once left on his desk. But they all looked staged now, as if they belonged to another couple entirely. It's strange. The things you start noticing when you know the truth but can't reveal it. The subtle shift in his tone when he mentioned business. The way he checked his phone before every smile. The faint smirk he wore when people praised him, as though he were feeding off their belief. I watched him closely, not as a wife anymore, but as a witness. Daniel had always been charismatic, effortlessly so. That was part of his charm. He could walk into a room and bend it toward him, like gravity itself was partial to his confidence. But now, that same charm felt calculated, like a salesman rehearsing sincerity. The letter from my father haunted me. I'd memorized every line, every word. Upon marriage, Daniel will assume mentorship under the family trust. It was all there, the foundation of everything I thought was love. I started visiting my father's old office again. I told Daniel I was feeling nostalgic, that I missed him. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said it was sweet of me to keep his memory alive. He didn't know that memory was the weapon I was sharpening. Inside those walls, I found more than nostalgia. I found pieces of truth, half-shredded documents, unsigned drafts, old letters addressed to the board. My father had written about Daniel often. He described him as ambitious beyond his years and strategically aligned with the company's long-term vision. I kept reading until I reached a note dated just months before our wedding. My father had written, "Anna is deeply in love." I trust Daniel's intentions align with both her happiness and the company's future, even in death. My father's words felt like a hand pressing on my chest. Loving, but heavy with the weight of misplaced faith. The betrayal wasn't just Daniel's, It was systemic. It was a collaboration of trust between two men. One naive in love, the other deliberate in ambition. As the days passed, I started noticing how seamlessly Daniel talked about my father's company as his. My expansion plan, my board, my vision. Every time he said it, the word "my" scraped across my nerves like sandpaper. He'd built his identity on a foundation my father laid. And I, unknowingly, had been the bridge between them. One afternoon, I went to visit an old family accountant, a man named Harris, who had worked with my father for over 30 years before retiring quietly. He greeted me warmly, surprised but pleased to see me. His office smelled of old paper and ink. When I mentioned Daniel, something flickered in his eyes. Hesitation. "Your husband has done remarkable things for the company," he said, his tone careful. I smiled faintly. Remarkable things often come with remarkable costs, don't they? He didn't answer immediately. Then he sighed. "Your father believed in him, Anna. He saw in Daniel what he wanted to see. Someone capable of carrying the legacy. I warned him once, quietly, that Daniel's interests seemed pragmatic. But he wouldn't hear of it. He said love changes people. I looked at the old man and realized that love doesn't change people. It just exposes who they've always been. When I left his office, the world outside felt sharper. Too bright, too loud. It was as if every sound carried meaning now. The whir of passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians, even the wind pressing against my face. All of it felt like static around a single truth. I had spent 25 years sleeping beside a man who had married my inheritance. Not my heart. That night, Daniel hosted a dinner. It was supposed to be intimate, just a few of his colleagues and their spouses. He'd been hosting more of these lately, networking events dressed up as social gatherings. I dressed in quiet defiance, not in the usual elegance he preferred, but something simpler. Soft gray, no jewelry. I didn't need to shine that night. I needed to see. The guests arrived, laughter filling the house. I played the gracious hostess, pouring wine, smiling at the right moments. But my eyes stayed on Daniel. He moved through the room like a conductor, every gesture purposeful. At one point I heard one of his partners mention an upcoming merger, something I hadn't known about. I glanced at Daniel and he noticed. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. That flicker was all I needed to confirm it. He'd started cutting me out entirely. After the guests left, I found him in his study, reviewing something on his tablet. His voice was calm when I asked what the merger was about. "Just business, Anna," he said. "You wouldn't be interested." He didn't even look up, and that's when I felt it. The clean, cold clarity of truth. He didn't even need to lie anymore. I was no longer part of his illusion. I was an asset already depreciated. I went to bed that night with my eyes open. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how many moments of my life had been built on sand. How many "I love yous" were merely rehearsals in persuasion. The next morning, I called my lawyer, discreetly, from a number Daniel couldn't trace. I asked him to review the company's current structure, quietly, under the guise of curiosity. He hesitated, but I told him it was personal. A week later, he called back. His voice was low. "Anna, did you know your husband holds controlling shares under your father's trust?" I didn't respond. "I didn't need to," he continued. "The documents show transfer of rights initiated after your father's death. It's unusual, legally sound, but ethically questionable." That phrase, ethically questionable, carried the weight of everything I'd been feeling for months. After the call, I sat in the garden behind the house. The roses were blooming, delicate, pale pink, just like the ones Daniel had sent me on our first anniversary. I used to love them. Now I could barely stand to look. They felt dishonest, too perfect, too practiced. The following days were a blur of observation. Daniel was still himself, polite, composed, efficient. But I started noticing small carelessnesses. A misplaced folder, a text that lit up his screen before he could hide it, a phone call that ended too abruptly. One evening, after he left for a late meeting, I opened his study again. This time, I didn't feel guilty. I wasn't snooping. I was reclaiming. Inside his drawer, beneath a stack of documents, I found a printed email. It was dated 6 months earlier, from one of his partners. The subject line read, "Trust Transition Timeline." The email discussed the final transfer of the remaining shares, the last piece of the company that had legally still been under my name. The transfer would be complete upon a mutual consent, filing, a clause I'd unknowingly signed years ago. During a routine audit, my signature sat there in black ink, proof of my own blind devotion. I felt sick, physically sick. My hand trembled as I held the paper, the room spinning around me. It wasn't just that he'd used me, it was that he'd planned it meticulously, every move choreographed long before love ever entered the equation. And the cruelest part? He'd succeeded. When I heard his car pull into the driveway, I placed everything back exactly where I'd found it. I sat in the dark, still, listening to his footsteps. When he entered, he smiled, kissed my forehead, and asked if I'd eaten. I nodded. He poured himself a drink, humming softly. Watching him then, calm, content, untroubled, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not rage, not heartbreak, just a deep bone-deep understanding. I finally saw him clearly. I wasn't married to a man. I was married to an ambition wearing a human face. That night, as he slept beside me, I turned on my side and studied him in the dark. His breathing was even, peaceful. I wondered if he'd ever felt guilt. If, in some hidden corner of his mind, he'd ever loved me in any real way. But the answer didn't matter anymore. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to confront him yet. Not with words, not with anger. I needed to dismantle his world the same way he'd dismantled mine. Quietly, systematically, without warning. For 25 years, I had been the loyal wife, the silent partner, the believer. Now, I would become something else. The architect of his undoing. I smiled to myself as the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains. Love had blinded me once. But clarity, that was far sharper, and I was ready to use it. There are moments when truth arrives with a softness that makes you think it might be mercy. Mine arrived with the crisp snap of a stapled folder as I opened it alone in the study. I had meant to look for confirmations. Numbers, charts, signatures, things a lawyer would call evidence. What I found instead felt like the cleanest confession. A folder labeled with my father's name, folded spreadsheets, annotated memos, and one folder at the bottom with a single file stamped confidential, transfer schedule. My hands went cold before I read a line. My breath fogged in the quiet room, as if the air itself paused to watch me learn what had been hidden there for years. Every entry was methodical. Dates, amounts, signatures, and a pattern that mapped out 2 decades of planning. Transfers executed at precise intervals. Shell entities named and dissolved. Percentages gradually moved from the trust to an entity under Daniel's control. My signature appeared in places I barely remembered signing routine audits, the ink now a ghost of my younger trust. There was a clause, buried in legalese, that permitted a so-called mutual consent transfer under conditions that Daniel had engineered. The clause read like a doorway with no guardian. For a long time, I simply stared. The room rotated slowly, not from dizziness, but from the sudden reordering of everything I believed in. Photos on the shelves blurred, their edges softening into the shape of the life they had been meant to prove. The chandelier above me felt like a washed map of old constellations. Once guiding, now irrelevant. I felt the paper beneath my fingertips as if it were a live thing, pulsing with the deliberate cruelty of a plan executed in polite handwriting. Microhook. The discovery wasn't a single betrayal. It was an architecture. I went back through the files like someone retracing steps in a house built to trap. There were notes in my father's hand. Praise for Daniel, gratitude for stability. A line about ensuring the company remains in safe hands. There were emails from Daniel to board members, casual in tone, discussing timelines as if he'd never married me at all. He'd included phrases like ensure transition, aligns with family interests, and discreet execution requested. The word discreet fell against my chest like a stone. It hit me how calmly the world had been rearranged around a lie. How my father's trust had been the currency, and I the unwitting exchange. The realization was cold but precise. I had not lost a lover. I had been part of a succession plan, a human instrument, useful to be married, useful to sign documents in good faith, useful to legitimize a takeover that would have looked sordid if done openly. It wasn't impulsive greed. It was patient architecture. Microhook. The man who had promised forever had built forever for himself, not for us. There was a moment then when memory betrayed me, and each ordinary act replayed with a new, sharpened meaning. That anniversary trip, where Daniel had been unusually attentive, now felt like an exercise in visibility. The nights he'd suggested I not attend certain board meetings felt like curated absences. The times he'd praised my father's decisions were not affectionate partnerships, but rehearsed approvals. Every kindness was an alibi. Every promise was an invoice. My body responded in a way that surprised me. I expected a scream, a collapse, something cinematic to validate the depth of deceit. Instead, I felt a numbness roll in like winter fog, slow, thorough, occupying everything. My hands trembled, but my voice did not. My knees remained steady. The shock didn't fracture me. It clarified me. The anger that could have roared boiled into a cold precision. I felt the sharpness of a blade tempered into a scalpel. The files offered more than corporate theft. There were letters between Daniel and a small network of trustees and lawyers, a choreography of consent and timing. They had chosen moments of vulnerability. After my father's illness, during the annual audit, after the publicity of a successful merger. They had moved when the house was full of grief and when I was expected to be distracted with memorials and condolences. It was cruel in its kindness, careful in its brutality. Microhook. Betrayal revealed itself as intention, not accident. I remember the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen, as if to remind me that the house was still functioning on its usual schedule. I made tea automatically. The steam rose in a white column that blurred the pages as I read them again and again. With each reread, the intent became cruelly clear. They had trusted my performance of grief and used it to fill legal forms. They had treated my love as collateral. I tried to imagine his face when he concealed this. Would he have felt guilt, or only the tidy satisfaction of a job well executed? In the thin light through the curtains, he looked smaller in my memory. Not diminished because of wrongdoing, but because the scale of his ambition had made him less human. His charm was now a tool, his warmth a strategy. The man who had once held me like a shelter had become an architect of my displacement. When I finally closed the folder, the room seemed sharper, its edges defined by truth. The silence that followed was neither empty nor peaceful. It was a presence, heavy, observant, like a room awaiting judgment. I walked through the houses, noticing details I had never let myself see. The precise placement of his cufflinks in a velvet tray, a drawer of receipts labeled business, the careful order of photos where he always stood slightly forward. Everything had been staged for an audience I had assumed we both belonged to. Microhook. The middle of life can hide an entire plan. The middle of marriage can hide an exit door. I slept very little that night. When I finally lay down, the ceiling felt like a ledger, each beam a line item. I remember thinking of the small human ledger I had become, the years of dinners, favors, illness care, the quiet work of keeping a home that allowed business to run smoothly. Those entries had value once. Now they read like footnotes in someone else's testament. What surprised me most wasn't the fact of being used. It was the particular grief that came with knowing I had consented, that my signature was proof of my own complicity. The betrayal was doubled, by his ambition and by my willingness to believe. That compound feeling was a strange, bitter calculus. It made the pain less theatrical and more accountable. It made it mine to resolve. By dawn, the files were back where I'd found them, slid beneath the folder as if to hide evidence I feared exposing to my own will. I walked to the window and watched the city wake up in ordinary patterns, oblivious. People were still walking dogs, taxis still honking, life continuing with the comfortable cruelty of the world. I didn't want humiliation or revenge. I wanted clarity and a plan. The revelation had not left me broken so much as awake and equipped. The old me, the trusting woman who had married for love and believed in continuity, had been archived. In her place sat someone with the quiet knowledge of what had been taken and how it had been taken. The midpoint twist didn't end my story. It redrew its map. The heartbreak that followed was not a collapse, but a pivot. Grief as a blueprint, betrayal as instruction. I realized then that the next moves would have to be deliberate, patient, and unshowy. Whatever I chose next would not be spectacular. It would be a calculation, the exact response to a lifetime of performed sincerity. For the first time in years, I felt not lost but positioned. The files had given me a weapon not of spite but of truth. And truth I understood with a clarity that felt like cold light, cut straighter than any revenge. The room breathed with me as I made my decision. I would not be the woman who signed away her life a second time. I would learn how to read the contracts I'd once trusted. I would learn where the legal doors had been left ajar. The revelation hung in the air like a suspended note. waiting for the next beat. Morning came without mercy. The light through the window was too clean, too sharp, slicing across the desk where the files still rested, their corners slightly curled from my hands. I hadn't moved them since the night before. I wanted them there, visible, undeniable. Proof that I wasn't dreaming. Daniel left early, as usual. The click of the door closing behind him felt different now. Before, it had meant routine. Now, it sounded like escape. When the silence settled, I let the mask fall. My chest felt hollow, but not from sorrow, from the strange lightness that follows when illusion finally collapses. It was as if the air had changed texture. I could breathe again, but the air was colder. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even when I picked up the folder again, reading until the words blurred into static. There was no point crying for something that had never truly existed. What hurt wasn't the loss of love. It was the theft of belief, the way he'd built his empire brick by brick out of my faith. The following days passed in silence. I went about my routines carefully, deliberately, as if performing the role of Daniel's wife in a play that was nearing its final act. I smiled when expected, nodded through conversations, and laughed when prompted. He noticed nothing. That was the advantage of having been invisible for so long. When you start observing instead of participating, no one sees the shift. Micro hook. The quietest people often make the loudest discoveries. I began collecting information, not from confrontation, but observation. I visited the company under the pretense, nostalgia, foundation work, public appearances. The employees still adored me. To them, I was the elegant remnant of the founder's legacy. They spoke freely, unaware that I was no longer listening as a wife, but as a witness building a case. In meeting rooms, I caught fragments, mentions of expansion deals, private transfers, and strategic partnerships. The company was thriving. Yes, but beneath the numbers, the structure was fragile. Daniel had over-leveraged assets, hidden debt beneath confident reports. The empire he'd stolen wasn't steady. It was hollow. That irony almost made me smile. He had married power, not love, and in doing so, he'd chained himself to something that could collapse with one good push. At night, when he returned home, he talked about business with a pride that bordered on arrogance. He poured whiskey, loosened his tie, and recited the language of control. I nodded, listening to the sound of his downfall in his own words. Microhook. Sometimes revenge doesn't need a plan. It just needs patience. The transformation wasn't immediate. It was subtle, internal. Each day I grew quieter, sharper. The pain I once thought would destroy me began to shape me. My reflection changed too. My eyes no longer searched for reassurance in the mirror. They watched, calculated. I started seeing him for what he truly was, a man terrified of losing control. I noticed the way his expression stiffened when I deviated from routine, the small flickers of suspicion when I asked casual questions. He sensed something, perhaps, but he couldn't name it. He'd always underestimated me. That would be his final mistake. One evening after dinner, I found him in the living room reading reports. I stood at the doorway, studying the man I'd once thought was my home. His hair was silver now, his face harder, older, ambition carved into his features like stone. He looked up and smiled faintly, unaware of the war unfolding just a few feet away. "You're quiet lately," he said. "I've just been thinking," I replied. "About what?" "About how well you've managed to keep everything under control all these years." He chuckled softly, taking a sip of his drink. "That's what I do best." Yes, I thought. That's what you do until control becomes your prison. Microhook. The most dangerous cage is the one a man builds for himself. After that, I began making quiet preparations. I visited my lawyer again, this time under no pretense. I told him everything, every file, every clause, every signature. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he looked at me for a long time. "Do you want to expose him?" he asked. "No," I said. "I want to free myself first. Exposure can come later." We spent weeks reconstructing the company's structure, tracing ownership lines and identifying weaknesses. My father had left fragments of protection buried within the paperwork. Safety clauses, hidden in fine print, that still tied portions of the trust back to me. Daniel had overlooked them, too confident to read what he thought he'd already won. Those overlooked details became my leverage. Each night, while he slept, I read contracts, board records, annual reports, every document that had once intimidated me. I taught myself his language. The corporate jargon that once sounded like noise has now become my weapon. I discovered one final clause buried in the Foundation Charter. Any fraudulent transfer under misrepresentation of consent could be reversed pending proof. All I needed was evidence and time. Time was something I'd learned to live inside. I stopped waiting for confrontation. I began preparing for release. Micro hook. Freedom doesn't arrive in fury. It arrives in formality. The change in me didn't go unnoticed. Daniel began watching me differently, perhaps sensing the distance, but not its reason. He tried to restore balance. Small gestures, planned dinners, expensive gifts, guilt disguised as affection. But those gestures only exposed how little he understood me now. I no longer needed his attention. I needed his absence. I started spending more time outside, long walks, meetings, visits to charity boards that my father had once supported. People began calling me Mrs. Caldwell again, not Daniel's wife. The distinction mattered. Slowly, quietly, I reclaimed my name. One afternoon, I received a message from the accountant I had once visited. Harris. I found something you might want to see, he'd written. We met in his office where he handed me an old external drive. It's from your father's archive, he said. Contains his private notes. Things not included in official files. When I opened it later, I found audio recordings, my father's dictations. In one, his voice cracked with age and illness. I trust Daniel, he said softly. But sometimes I wonder if his loyalty is to me or to what I represent. Anna loves him. That should mean something, shouldn't it? It was that pause, that quiet, uncertain, shouldn't it, that broke me. The first tears since it all began. Not for Daniel, for my father, and for the part of me that had inherited his hope. The tears didn't weaken me. They washed away the last of my denial. From that moment, everything became simpler. I knew what I had to do. I gathered the documents, the recordings, and the original letter. All of it organized, labeled, and ready. I didn't rush. I waited for the right moment because timing was everything to him. And this time, it would be mine. Days stretched into weeks, and I kept my silence. Daniel continued believing in his illusion of control. The company thrived on paper, but cracks were forming. Subtle inconsistencies in reports, rising whispers in board meetings. I didn't have to destroy him. The truth was already starting to do that on its own. And me? I was becoming someone else entirely. The nights no longer felt haunted. The silence that once hurt now felt like armor. I began sleeping again. Deeply. Peacefully. The kind of sleep that comes not from ignorance, but from certainty. Micro hook. There's a strange calm that follows the decision to stop being afraid. By the end of that month, I had everything I needed. The evidence, the leverage, the clarity. All that remained was the moment. The one moment when the man who had used my life as his ladder would finally look up and realize the rungs were gone. I didn't know yet what form that reckoning would take. Public, private, or poetic. But I knew it would come quietly, elegantly, and without warning. Because some storms don't announce themselves. They arrive in silence, and when they do, they take everything built on lies. It happened on a Thursday. The air was clean, cold, and unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that feels like a pause before a storm. Daniel had arranged a formal dinner to celebrate a new business merger. Investors, board members, family friends, everyone important enough to be seen, but distant enough to forget sincerity. The invitation carried my name too, though I suspected it was out of habit, not affection. I went, not as his wife, but as his reckoning. The event was held in the grand hall of the same hotel where we'd celebrated our engagement 25 years ago. I remembered that night. The laughter, the music, the way he'd looked at me as though I was the final piece of his perfect life. I'd believed it then. Standing in that same space now, I saw it for what it truly was. A performance. The chandeliers glimmered like 1,000 quiet witnesses. Waiters glided through the crowd. The smell of wine, expensive perfume, and polished marble lingered in the air. Everything was perfect, exactly as Daniel liked it. He stood near the podium, surrounded by men in suits, confident, commanding, his smile rehearsed, the king of a kingdom built on borrowed bricks. When he spotted me, surprise flickered across his face. Fleeting, then quickly masked by charm. "You came," he said, approaching. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied softly, and I meant it. Microhook. Sometimes you must walk into the fire, not to burn, but to show you can't be consumed. The speeches began. Toasts, laughter, glasses clinking. Daniel took the stage, thanking the guests, speaking about loyalty, growth, and legacy, words that now tasted like poison. As he spoke, I watched the projection screen behind him, a presentation his assistant had prepared. Company milestones, partnerships, and photos of achievements. My father's image appeared for a moment, smiling beside Daniel in a picture I'd always loved. That's when I moved. While the audience clapped, I walked to the sound technician by the side console. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I had already lived through the hardest part, discovery. What came next was only truth, finally given its voice. "Can you switch to this drive for the next part?" I asked, handing him the small USB. I smiled, calm, confident. The kind of smile people don't question. He nodded and inserted it into the port. Ready for the next segment. Daniel was still speaking, completely unaware. "And I owe everything to the trust this company was founded on," he said. "To the people who believed in me, trust, belief." Words that once bound me to him now became the nails in his illusion. The screen flickered. The slide changed. At first, no one noticed. The lights dimmed slightly as the audio began to play. Soft, old, slightly grainy. My father's voice filled the room. "I trust Daniel," the recording said, gentle and aged. But sometimes I wonder if his loyalty is to me, or to what I represent. The words hung in the air, echoing across the marble. Daniel froze. The room went still. The next line followed, slower. "Anna loves him." That should mean something, shouldn't it? The silence that followed was total. Then the murmurs began. Quiet at first, then growing. Ripples spreading through the crowd. Daniel turned toward me, confusion hardening into fury. "What did you do?" he whispered under his breath. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The next image appeared, a scanned document. My father's original trust deed, annotated in his handwriting, highlighting the clauses Daniel had concealed. Then another slide. The falsified transfer forms. Then a screenshot of the private email he'd sent to his partner, bragging about finally securing the Caldwell Foundation. Gasps, whispers, cameras flashing. I stood perfectly still, calm, composed, watching as his empire crumbled, not with violence, but with quiet, methodical exposure. He tried to speak, to control the room, but his voice cracked. "This is a mistake," he stammered. "These are private." The crowd wasn't listening. The board members, men who'd always nodded at his authority, were already exchanging glances. Lawyers whispered. Investors checked their phones. The silence turned into judgment, and the judgment turned into distance. That's how betrayal dies. Not with confrontation, but isolation. Microhook. There's no sound louder than the moment everyone sees the truth. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "You married the company, Daniel. I just divorced you from both." He looked at me. Disbelief, rage, humiliation, all flickering at once. "You'll ruin everything," he hissed. "I'm not ruining anything," I said quietly. "I'm just ending a story you wrote in lies." I turned away, leaving him standing under the same lights that once crowned him. They were brighter now, too bright. The kind of light that reveals everything a man tries to hide. As I walked through the hall, people moved aside. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The whispers followed, but I didn't mind. They weren't my chains anymore. Outside, the air hit me like a baptism. Cold, clean, real. I inhaled deeply, letting it fill the space inside me that had been hollow for years. For the first time, I wasn't someone's wife. I was simply me. The next days unfolded like an aftermath. The news spread. The board suspended him pending investigation. Lawyers circled. His empire, so carefully crafted, began to collapse under its own deceit. I didn't gloat. I didn't watch it burn. I just let it happen. Because power built on betrayal doesn't need enemies. It destroys itself. Microhook. Revenge wasn't what I wanted. I wanted freedom. And sometimes they looked the same. I moved out of the house that week. Packed quietly, methodically. I took nothing that wasn't mine. Left everything that was. The house had once felt enormous. Now it felt small. Suffocating. like the echo of a lie. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't look back. There was nothing there worth remembering. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt slowly. I returned to the foundation my father had started, this time not as a legacy, but as a living thing. I met with people he'd helped, revived projects long abandoned. I found purpose again, not in proving anything to anyone, but in reclaiming the version of myself that had been buried under decades of pretense. The public, of course, had its opinions. Some pitied me. Some praised me. Some called me ruthless. None of it mattered. The truth didn't need defenders. It only needed air. And as for Daniel, I heard he'd sold his remaining shares. Retreated somewhere quiet where no one called him Sir anymore. I didn't hate him. I didn't love him. He had become something else. A story I'd already finished. Sometimes I wonder if he ever looks back. If he ever realizes that what he thought was control was really his undoing. I'll never know. And I don't need to, because the peace I found afterward wasn't dependent on his regret. It was born from my own. Regret for staying silent too long. Regret for mistaking devotion for love. Regret that took time and truth to finally let go of. The day I signed the final papers, the lawyer asked if I wanted to restore my maiden name. I smiled. No, I said. That name may have been tied to him, but now it belongs to me. That was the true transformation. Not revenge, not exposure, but reclamation. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked forward free. Peace didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, like dawn. Quiet, steady, almost imperceptible. The first morning I woke up alone in my new apartment, the air felt different. Not empty, just honest. The walls were bare, sunlight spilled freely through the curtains, and the only sound was the hum of the city below. For a moment, I simply sat there, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, feeling the world without him in it. It didn't hurt. It felt clean. I started rebuilding myself in small ways. Coffee at sunrise. I walked through the park where no one knew my name. Volunteering again with the foundation, meeting faces that reminded me why my father believed in people more than profits. They didn't care about legacies or balance sheets. They cared about effort, about presence. That was something Daniel could never understand. Micro hook. Healing isn't loud. It's found in the moments no one applauds. I began writing again. Journals, notes, reflections that spilled out of me like long withheld breath. At first, they were letters I'd never send. To my father, to the woman I used to be, to the man who mistook manipulation for love. But over time, the words stopped being about them. They became about me, about rediscovery. I learned the rhythm of solitude, how it could be both sharp and soothing, depending on how you held it. Some nights, I still felt the echo of old habits, the instinct to wait for a sound, a voice, a shadow moving through the hallway. But they passed. Slowly, they passed. The foundation grew under my care. Not in numbers or headlines, but in spirit. We reopened scholarships my father had once dreamed of, started community projects that carried his values forward. People began to see me not as the wife who exposed her husband, but as someone rebuilding something worth believing in. That meant more than any headline ever could. One afternoon, while organizing old files at the office, I found a letter tucked inside one of my father's journals. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a note written in his steady, looping handwriting. If you ever lose everything, remember, what you keep inside you is what was real all along. I folded that line into my mind like a prayer. Micro hook. Sometimes, the things we lose are the things that teach us how to be whole. Months passed. The noise faded. People stopped whispering about the scandal. The world, as it always does, moved on. So did I. I bought a small cottage outside the city. Nothing extravagant, just a place with space and silence. There was a garden behind it, overgrown but alive. I spent afternoons trimming it back, planting herbs, flowers, anything that felt like growth. The soil under my nails, the ache in my hands. They felt more real than any luxury I'd ever owned. There were days when memories still surfaced. The wedding, the laughter, the young woman who'd believed she was living a love story. I didn't resent her anymore. She was doing the best she could with what she knew. She had loved fully. Even if the love wasn't returned, that, I realized, was her strength, not her mistake. One evening, as I watched the sunset stain the horizon gold and violet, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't bitter or broken, just quiet, whole. The silence that once haunted me now kept me company. Sometimes I wonder if love itself ever truly dies, or if it just changes form, learning where it can safely exist. Maybe real love isn't found in grand gestures or promises whispered under chandeliers. Maybe it's in the courage to walk away from what betrays you, to rebuild not for revenge, but for peace. Microhook. Some endings don't close chapters. They rewrite the entire book. A year later, I attended the Foundation's annual gala, the first one held without Daniel's influence in decades. Standing at the podium, I looked out at the crowd, faces filled with warmth, not pretense. I spoke about resilience, honesty, and the strength it takes to start again. When the applause ended, I stepped away from the stage and let myself breathe. The music played softly. The room shimmered with quiet joy. Not the polished kind of success Daniel had chased, but something gentler, purer. As I stood there, someone approached, a young woman, nervous. Smiling, "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "thank you. The scholarship you created, it changed my life," I smiled. "Then keep changing it. For yourself. For others." When she walked away, I felt it. That quiet ripple inside. The one that comes when something broken has finally healed. Later that night, I returned home, slipped off my shoes, and stood by the window. Outside, the world moved as it always had. Cars, laughter, life. Inside, everything was still, peaceful. I poured a glass of water, sat down, and wrote one final line in my journal. It took time, but one morning I woke up and realized the silence no longer hurt. And for the first time in years, that silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like home. Sometimes the people who break us aren't villains. They're mirrors. They show us what parts of ourselves we handed away too easily, what dreams we buried in someone else's ambition. I used to think betrayal was the end of love, but it isn't. It's the revelation of where love was misplaced. When I look back now, I don't see 25 wasted years. I see a woman who kept believing in goodness, even when the world used that belief against her. I see someone who chose to rise, not because she was fearless, but because she finally understood she didn't need permission to begin again. That's the quiet truth no one tells you. Healing doesn't look like strength at first. It appears to be a state of confusion, stillness, and isolation. It's sitting alone at a table you once shared and realizing you're not waiting for anyone anymore. It's noticing that the air feels lighter, that your laughter returns without guilt, that your story still has chapters left to write. Microhook. The real victory isn't in revenge. It's in freedom. I learned that love is not measured by how much you endure, but by how much you refuse to betray yourself in the process. We're taught to fight for relationships, to fix what's broken, to forgive endlessly. But sometimes survival isn't in holding on. It's in walking away, not in bitterness, but in quiet grace. Because the truth is, peace doesn't arrive wrapped in apologies. It comes when you stop trying to rewrite what was never meant to stay. So if you've ever loved someone who used you, or trusted someone who twisted your faith into their gain, know this: you're not naive for loving deeply. You're human, and someday you'll wake up and realize the pain didn't destroy you. It revealed the strength you'd forgotten you had. What Daniel taught me wasn't about betrayal. It was about clarity, about how love without respect is dependency, and trust without honesty is surrender. I lost the man I thought I knew. But I found the woman I was always meant to be. And if you're watching this, maybe that's what you need to hear right now. You will survive this. You will rebuild. And one day you'll tell your story, not with bitterness, but with calm, certain peace. Sometimes the people who break us are the ones who teach us how to survive. What would you do if this were to happen to you? Would you stay silent, or would you rise? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, about love, loss, and the quiet power of becoming whole again, subscribe and stay with me. Because stories like this aren't about endings. They're about rebirth.